from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's ahead. K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will discuss today sulfur deficiency in winter wheat. That's a nutrient management subject that he's receiving questions about from more and more of you wheat growers. He'll get into the various fertilizer options for correcting a sulfur deficiency ahead of spring greenup. Following then, K-State's Sarah Lancaster and Tyler Meyeres. They'll talk about their recent study of field spray volumes and how they influence herbicide application efficiency and performance. Their work takes on added importance heading into this next growing season, which we'll outline. And on this week's edition of Milk Lines, K-State's Mike Brouk takes a look at the USDA's Dairy Margin Coverage Program, right here on Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network. Thanks once more for being along with us for Agriculture Today. Well, our guest now tells us that the topic that we'll take up here is being brought up to him with some frequency now as part of wheat nutrient management. Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension, is here to discuss sulfur deficiency in wheat. To think back, we brought this to the table some years ago, Dorivar, but you're saying now that it's really picking up in increased interest among growers, this nutrient concern.
Yes, Eric, this is one of the nutrients that's just becoming more limiting in many of our production systems. And we also paying more attention to it, which is good because we are, I think, taking care of potential deficiency in many situations. However, we do still see problems, and I think we need to identify where are the potential candidates, fields that may benefit from application of sulfur, because we also have to recognize it's not a problem that's happening across the entire state, and there are some soils that are going to be more susceptible, and so definitely need to pay attention to those soil types that could be responsive, and also then look for options for how to take care of that or prevent any potential issues.
Then what soil types are most prone to sulfur deficiencies?
Yes, typically this is something that we tend to see more on sandier soils in areas where we have low organic matter soils. So those are kind of has been the main problematic areas. Nowadays, we tend to see some fields that are expanding, and we tend to see it maybe in different textured soils as well. But in general, I will definitely pay attention more to soils that have maybe more than 20% sand content. Those are usually potential candidates for response to sulfur, and especially those who are getting lower in organic matter, close to about 1% or even lower than that. Those are definitely fields that will be potentially responsive to sulfur. We have to keep in mind that essentially the main source of sulfur in the soil is organic matter, and really the main pool of sulfur in the soil tends to be organic form, and so organic matter is a key factor, and also how basically that breakdown and mineralization happening over time. And we talk mostly about wheat because that's where we tend to see most of the problem. And again, this goes back to the cycling and availability of sulfur in the soil, which again is tied back to organic matter, mineralization, microbial activity. And so if we have low soil temperatures, we tend to see more sulfur issues early in the spring.
Again, how important is sulfur to wheat productivity, which will then lead us to think about symptoms that might show up out there?
Yes, and when we have significant deficiency symptoms showing up, obviously the effect on yields is quite large, and so we can see significant drop in yields if we have deficiency symptoms already show up. When it comes to deficiency symptoms, one of the things that often is a challenge is that sulfur deficiency can be very similar to nitrogen. We have similar yellowing that happens, and so oftentimes we tend to perhaps apply more nitrogen, and that's not really taking care of the issue, which is the sulfur deficiency. There are a few differences, though, and one of those is that if we look closer at the deficiency symptoms, the yellowing for sulfur usually happen in the younger leaves, the upper leaves, versus nitrogen, which is usually the lower leaves that has the chlorosis, the deficiency symptoms. So those are things that we need to watch very closely. Also, how these deficiency symptoms develop in the field. We tend to see more deficiency of sulfur in side slopes areas, and places where we have maybe a little bit more low organic matter content. And so those are usually a little bit different in terms of how we see these deficiency symptoms show up in the field when you compare that to nitrogen. And so again, whenever we see those problems, obviously we are potentially seeing significant losses in yield. Ideally, we want to avoid getting to that point, and that's really what we need to be thinking ahead, how we can identify those fields and maybe apply sulfur ahead of time before we have any deficiency symptoms show up, which again, at that point, more likely we're already losing yields.
Typically, then, when will those symptoms express themselves? Later on in the late winter, early spring? What?
Yes, and that's a challenge, Eric, because deficiency symptoms usually will happen when you have green up happening in the early spring. And so at that point, we have to quickly find options as a top dress application to basically do any rescue application to recover those crops. But again, before that, we won't really see anything, and so we need to rely a little bit more on identifying potential fields, and soil testing is really the key there. And so we need to be looking at soil testing. Like I say, we like to also pay attention to texture, soil texture, and organic matter, especially anything above 20% sand content, and especially below 1.5% organic matter, those two key characteristics. But we also do have testing for sulfur. Now, we have to keep in mind this is a mobile nutrient, and so we really need to be looking at the profile sulfur content, and that's recommended. Depth is really 24 inches if we can collect that sample. And the reason for this, again, because it's a mobile nutrient, but we also have the potential to have some accumulation of sulfur in clay layers. If we do have some clay layers below in deeper depths, we can have some good accumulation of sulfur in. That's the reason why we need to look at the entire profile. Oftentimes we test sulfur for the shallow samples, say 6 inches. That certainly is not going to give us the entire picture of what we have there, and it may be a misleading value if we're looking at sulfur, again, because we're talking about a mobile nutrient.
If one determines that, yes, that wheat field out there is short on sulfur, then selecting the fertilizer to correct that deficiency, several options at hand here, both in the dry and the liquid form. What should one consider?
Yes, Eric, we have many options, and that's a good thing about sulfur in particular. It can also be a little bit challenging because one of the considerations with sulfur fertilizer is that there could be differences in plant availability, which is different compared to other nutrients. One of those that maybe is the most popular one, and usually the cheapest source, is dry elemental sulfur. This is a source that's pretty high in sulfur content, usually more than 90% sulfur content. However, one of the challenges with the elemental sulfur is that it needs more time to oxidize. It basically becomes plant available. That means if we are doing even fall apply ahead of wheat, that usually is not going to be available for that crop. And we have several studies evaluating this, and it's particularly a challenge for drier environments out in central western Kansas where we don't have the moisture during the winter months, and obviously low temperature will not allow for that elemental sulfur to oxidize. However, there are some huge benefits with elemental sulfur, and that means if we are planning ahead and we are already including elemental sulfur as a part of our fertility program over a multiple year plan, we can essentially see slow release of that elemental sulfur over multiple years, easily over at least a couple years time frame. And so this is also something to think about. If we're thinking about just taking care of sulfur, over multiple crops, elemental sulfur can play a good role there, especially in places where maybe have potential for leaching. Again, more of sandy soils, we have enough precipitation, leaching could be a concern. And so again, elemental sulfur can help in that kind of situation.
There are other products, though, that can provide more immediate relief.
Yes, and in the cases of top dressing, of course, which is the question now, is we need to be thinking about things like ammonium sulfate, which is going to be immediately available, and also provide, of course, nitrogen. And so ammonium sulfate, dry ammonium sulfate, can be an excellent source to provide both nitrogen and sulfur as a top dress application. Gypsum, calcium sulfate, is another option. Solubility is slightly lower compared to ammonium sulfate, but can also also provide sulfate available during the growing season. And then for those using more of a liquid system, we have options. Anything that has thiosulfate, could be ammonium thiosulfate or potassium thiosulfate, are also alternatives. And again, those can be blended with UAN and can be applied as a top dress application. So those are good options for top dress application. Again, immediately available, just like nitrogen, and the plant basically should be able to respond fairly quickly to that. There's one more category, which is really more of a dry fertilizer source, which is really intended to supply primarily phosphorus, but also including sulfur in the mix now. And these are different brands out there that basically provides, it's essentially a blend of a mix of ammonium phosphate, and so it has nitrogen, phosphorus, and also has sulfur, and some of them maybe have also zinc in the mix. And so many people using these kind of products as a phosphorus source may already be taking care of that sulfur needs as well. So this is something to think about, those that may be putting in for phosphorus source that maybe already have some sulfur in it, that may be already, again, taking care of the needs.
But you need to confirm what's happening by way of that test if you have any doubts whatsoever, and that needs to happen rather promptly.
Yes, that's an excellent point. We need to be collecting those samples fairly soon, especially ahead of top dressing fertility program. And again, we need to be thinking about, of course, nitrogen, what we have available already, what else may be needed, and this is an excellent time to also look at that sulfur needs and whether or not we need to complement a little bit of sulfur in our top dressing program coming this late winter, early spring.
Happens to be an extension publication on sulfur in Kansas that you can find at the K-State Research and Extension online bookstore, as well as an article on the very topic in the most recent Agronomy E-Update newsletter on sulfur deficiency in wheat. Dorivar, thank you for covering this with us.
Thank you.
Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz is a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. After this break, another take on herbicide application approaches with our next guests. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We're back now on this Agriculture Today, and if you've been tuned in the last several weeks, we're talking frequently now about optimizing those herbicide applications as we get into this next growing season because of going concerns over the availability and the cost of those herbicide products. Here's one more consideration that our guests have been looking at through research. Sarah Lancaster, as you know, is a weed management specialist with K-State Research and Extension, and Tyler Meyeres is a graduate researcher working with Sarah on this specific project, examining spray volumes and their impact on residual herbicide activity. And Sarah, this is a heightened emphasis, being efficient and looking at residuals as an important component in the growing season coming up.
That's right, Eric. As weed scientists, we often emphasize the importance of pre-emergence herbicides for successful weed control throughout the growing season. But as we think specifically about what we're facing potentially for the summer of 22, we really want to emphasize how can we best utilize those residual herbicides. And so, there are some other factors that came into play in terms of designing Tyler's research project, and I'll let her talk about some of those other factors, but definitely, we typically think about spray volume as being a post-emergent herbicide concern, but we're finding that it may in some situations have impacts on how our pre's work as well.
Well, tie those principles together as we get into your work, Tyler, looking at spray volumes and their relationship to how those pre-emergence products and the residual activity unfolds here. How did you get at this question?
So we really wanted to develop this question to target our producers, and we actually recently had a survey come out looking at those application parameters that producers struggle with. And so we came up with this objective to quantify the effects of residual herbicide applications in corn as influenced by different application timings as well as spray volume. So when it comes to sprayer efficiency, you can look at it from several different avenues, and we chose to look at spray volume. And so we established 2 field sites, one in Colby, Kansas, to kind of target that drier, more arid climate. And we also established one in Ottawa, Kansas, to target that more temperate type of environment. And so something about Ottawa was actually very poor conditions. As you guys probably know, we received about 15 inches of rain directly after planting. And so by the time it dried out, it was too late to replant the corn. So we just rolled with it, and we had poor stands. And that kind of affected our results in this trial. So each trial had 2 different early post-emergence applications. So our early post was applied at V2 and with 2 different herbicides. So that first herbicide was Resicor plus Roundup and Atrazine. And so Resicor is clopyralid, acetochlor, and mesotrione. And then a new herbicide that's coming out on the market is Trivolt, and it should be available this coming year. And Trivolt is isoxaflutol, thiocarbazone, and flufenicet. So flufenicet isn't commercially available in the U.S. on its own. It's a herbicide that's commonly seen in the EU for like specialty crops, but it's also group 15, and it's a little different than acetochlor as far as it has a little less water solubility, and so it's going to stay in the soil longer and have some more residual herbicide effects on like your grasses and your small seed broadleaves. And then we had a late post application that took place at V8, or about 48 inches. And so that was Status and Roundup. And we used 3 different carrier volumes. We used 6, 13, and 20 gallons per acre. So we wanted to target a pretty large spectrum of spray volumes just because 6 is something you might see commonly for pre-emergence herbicide applications. And I know we're not using a pre-emergence herbicide application, but there are a lot of producers in Kansas that are using an early post application instead of a pre. And then we wanted to use that 20 GPA just to target that high end that you often see producers using, especially with post applications. So we had several different ratings throughout the season for weed control. We looked at weed control in Ottawa on common water hemp and fall panicum, and then in Colby it was Palmer amaranth. So just to kind of sum up our weed control ratings, it seemed like Resicor applied at the 20 gallons per acre had higher control than Resicor applied at the 6 gallons per acre. But something interesting was that Trivolt applied at the 6 gallons per acre actually had a pretty high level of control. And so that kind of goes against what we normally think of when it comes to spray volume. We normally think that the greater the spray volume, the greater the control. And so it's just a very interesting results that we're getting with this trial.
What do you think were the variables that affected those resulting levels of control by the various spray volumes then, and the expectation, like you said, the greater the volume, the greater the control, but you had an exception. What was happening there if you speculate at all here?
I really think it has to come down to the conditions surrounding those applications. So when we were applying those applications in Ottawa, the ground was still squishy. And so I don't know if that had anything to do with it, and that's part of the reason why we're going to replicate at more site years next year. I guess to sum it all up, under good conditions, low spray volumes can be utilized with residual applications without compromising weed control. But under these challenging environmental conditions like we saw in Ottawa, producers might need to be a little bit more strategic about their selection of residual herbicides and their spray volumes. And so all of this we want to use to do an economic analysis and a sprayer efficiency analysis. And so I think that's really important because it's going to make it more applicable to Kansas producers.
But your general conclusions from this year's study holds for both sites by and large, Colby as well as Ottawa, as you said, very distinctively different growing environments.
Yes.
Tyler, it is worth noting as well that this work that you're involved with in this area is not unique to the world. There have been other similar parallel studies that lend some more to the discussion over spray volumes.
Yes, Eric, you're completely correct. So there's actually a paper out of New Zealand in 2015 where they looked at the effect of spray volume and rigid ryegrass control with trifluralin and pyroxasulfone, and they found that as spray volumes increased, they actually saw more control. But we need to remember with those types of herbicides, they are very non-water soluble, and so they do need more water for activation. And also something about New Zealand, it has very similar climate to western Kansas, so that's something else to consider. There's actually another paper that's really recent, as of this year, is from Wisconsin, which is going to be more of a better conditions than what we see maybe in Kansas. And they saw no effect on pre-emergence applications from spray volume or herbicide.
So, Sarah, you and Tyler have been poring over what you've found so far, and you intend to continue this work another year, is that correct?
Yeah, Tyler's going to get to repeat these studies at Ottawa and at Colby, and probably will add a third location here in Manhattan next year to get her a more well-rounded data set.
But when we think about this coming growing season, then, should anything be drawn from what was found out in 2021, in that we had these variabilities in growing conditions, for instance, and other effects? Or can producers go with the premise that higher volumes, greater efficiency and efficacy?
I am not clairvoyant. I do not have a crystal ball. But thinking about what our friends like Chip are saying about the weather forecast for 22 and the hot, dry conditions that we're expecting. So knowing that and knowing the extra pressure that we're going to be putting on our pre-emergence herbicides potentially, given the expected limitations in terms of Liberty and Roundup for the summer, I would think that if a producer were interested in trying to see what these higher spray volumes look like, this would potentially be a year that it would pay, and they might see some differences in the field, given the drier conditions and the extra pressure we're putting on our pre's.
And something else producers might need to consider is, with those drier conditions, what residual herbicides they use. And so we might not have a lot of precipitation this year. We might not want to use Zidua, as it takes about an inch of rain to get that activated. You might think of something less water-soluble like the Acetochlor. Because if you're not getting a lot of that rainfall, you might get a really good amount of residual weed control from Acetochlor.
There's a lot of things to contemplate here, though, and you've been advocating that, Sarah, that producers need to start formulating a fairly detailed game plan here on their herbicide applications. This could be part of that.
Absolutely, I think so. I can't emphasize enough for folks just how important it's going to be this year to be on your game early, taking possession of those herbicides early. A lot of the manufacturers have got distribution plans. And so I know I'm going to contradict myself a little bit. We're saying get it as soon as possible, but know that for some products, the manufacturers are distributing product in such a way as to prevent kind of hoarding either at the farm level or at the retailer level.
Very good. Well, thank you for both going over this information that you've generated. And Tyler, we're looking forward to you furthering this work and discovering still more about spray volume adjustments and how they do impact the overall performance of our herbicides out there, and particularly the residual control aspect of that. Appreciate you covering this with us.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks for having us, Eric.
Along with us from the Department of Agronomy at K-State, Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster and graduate researcher Tyler Meyeres, zeroing in on Tyler's direct work on spray volumes and how those do relate to the efficacy of herbicides and their activity, particularly that residual performance of those products. Incidentally, Tyler presented this work to peers at the recent meeting of the North Central Weed Science Society, their annual gathering in Michigan. We'll be back with more. This is Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and time for this week's edition of Milk Lines, featuring K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. And Mike takes up here the opportunity for you dairy producers to enroll in what has become a much relied upon USDA program for dairy operations. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning signing up for the 2022 Dairy Margin Coverage Program through your local USDA Farm Service Agency. I know many of you have participated in this program for the last several years, and for those of you that haven't, maybe this is a year that you should take a look and see whether or not you should be signing up for this. Sign up runs through February 18th of 2022, so you've got some time to make some decisions, but there are some major changes to the program. First, there's been some changes as to how feed cost will be calculated. Moving forward, feed cost will be based on the price of premium alfalfa, 100%, rather than in the past only 50% of the alfalfa price was associated with premium alfalfa hay. So should increase the cost of feed, and it should help us maybe regain some of the margins that we haven't seen in the past with the way that calculations were done. So it should be an advantage to us moving forward. The other thing that you need to think about is if you've been an expanding dairy in the past, you may not have been eligible to insure all of your production because of the base that was used to calculate how much you could insure. So with the changes in the new program, there's an opportunity to go back into 2021 and recalculate what you had listed as your base. So if you expanded your dairy in the last few years, you might want to take a look at this option. It could mean several thousands of dollars to your dairy. This is only for dairies that produce less than 5 million pounds of milk each year. So if you're above that, you would not be eligible for this recalculation. If you're below the 5 million pound rule, then you would be eligible for a recalculation of your base. And I would encourage you to check that out with your Farm Service agency to see whether or not you're actually eligible for additional coverage in 2021. The other thing that you need to think about as you consider whether or not you want to sign up for 2022 and beyond is whether or not it's going to benefit your dairy. Again, if you're under 5 million pounds, I think you need to really consider this program. If you look at the history of the program, either signing up for the least amount of coverage or the greatest amount of coverage has proven to be beneficial to our dairy farms. There are some calculation tools that are available through the Farm Service Agency that will help you better understand the cost of the premiums versus the benefits and where that might figure into your bottom line. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to consider signing up for the Dairy Margin Coverage Program to benefit their operations in 2022 and beyond.
Thanks, Mike. And again, do have that conversation with your local FSA staff about participating in that program. Just as an added bit of information as we round out today's broadcast, something that we haven't really mentioned before, the Animal Sciences and Industry Department here at K-State does have its own app that allows users to search for educational events and activities hosted by the department. The app also includes access to online educational tools and news, and among its other features, you can receive exclusive alerts prior to and during Animal Sciences and Industry events. You can download resources including schedules, biographies, frequently asked questions, and more. You can even submit event photos, and there are several more functions of this app. It's available in Google Play and Apple stores. So just search for K-State Animal Sciences and Industry app and make it part of your suite of phone apps. Take advantage of it. And with that, our time is away once again. As always, we appreciate you tuning in and welcome you right back here tomorrow, this same time. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.